There's a pigeon on the ledge above the entrance to a coffee shop on a street you've walked down hundreds of times. You've never looked at it directly. You've never thought about it. You walked past it this morning and yesterday morning and the morning before that, and every single time, without any conscious recognition, you registered it as furniture, as part of the urban texture, as irrelevant. But here's the thing that no one talks about. It has been looking at you, not in the way that sounds dramatic when you first hear it, not with predator interest, not with the focused attention of something that wants something from you. Just watching, registering, filing, the way a patient intelligence does when it has nowhere else to be and nothing to lose by paying attention. This is the story of a creature that most of us have decided, collectively and without much deliberation, is not worth thinking about. And it is also the story of what happens when something watches you carefully enough for long enough that it begins to know you in ways you may never have considered possible. City birds occupy a strange psychological space for the people who live alongside them. They are abundant enough to be invisible. They are present enough to be unremarkable. The human brain, which evolved to prioritize novelty and filter repetition, essentially learns to edit pigeons out of conscious experience sometime around childhood and never fully reverses that edit. Walk through any busy urban square and watch where people's eyes go. They track other humans. They track movement that suggests purpose or threat. They track the screens in their hands, the birds that move between their feet, that settle on the ledges above their heads, that occasionally brush close enough to stir the air near someone's shoulder. These register as background, as ambient city noise, but visual. What's unusual about this isn't that humans do it. The filtering mechanism is sensible, even necessary. Urban environments carry more simultaneous sensory information than the nervous system can consciously process, and the brain becomes efficient about what it elevates to attention. What's unusual is that the pigeons do not do the same thing to us. Research into bird cognition has, in the last 2 decades, quietly accumulated evidence that challenges nearly everything assumed about avian intelligence. The older assumption that bird brains were structurally too simple for complex cognition has been progressively dismantled, not through a single dramatic discovery, but through incremental studies that kept producing results that didn't fit the old model. One category of findings stands apart. Pigeons, the birds most frequently stepped around, most casually dismissed, the birds referred to in the plural as a nuisance, have demonstrated a consistent and reproducible ability to recognize individual human faces. Not human faces in the abstract, individual faces. Yours, specifically. The studies designed to confirm this weren't straightforward to construct because the skeptical objection is obvious. Pigeons respond to many things. They respond to color, movement, silhouette, sound. How do you know it's the face? So researchers stripped the variables away. They used the same clothing, the same posture, the same context, and changed only the face. They used photographs and live interactions. They had people wear masks and then remove them. And across multiple experimental designs, the finding held. Pigeons distinguish individual human faces from one another, and they retain that distinction over time. Not for hours, not for days, for years. Think for a moment about what that actually means in the context of a city. You moved to your neighborhood 3 years ago. On the first morning, you walked to the corner store. There was a cluster of pigeons outside. You may have moved through them without noticing. They noticed you. They registered your face, the particular arrangement of your features, the specific proportions, and stored it. Somewhere in the compact neural architecture of a bird most people would struggle to describe as intelligent, a record began. Every morning since, when you've passed that stretch of street, something registered your return. Not with excitement, not with recognition in the way a dog demonstrates recognition, with all its visible enthusiasm. Just quietly, an internal notation, a confirmation, this one again. And around that notation, over time, associations formed. Because pigeons don't just recognize faces, they attach meaning to them. In cities, the meaning attached to human faces by pigeons tends to fall, broadly, into 2 categories: those who have been sources of food and those who have been sources of threat. This sounds simple. It is not. The threat category is particularly well documented, partly because it emerged from observations in unexpected places. Pest control workers, researchers, and city officials who attempted to disturb or cull urban pigeon populations noticed something strange happening after sustained contact. The birds began responding to those specific individuals before any action was taken. They would scatter at a distance. They would avoid routes where those people were present. They would change their foraging patterns based on who was in the area. The birds were not responding to uniforms because the behavior persisted when clothing was changed. They were not responding to aggressive body language because it occurred before any was displayed. They were responding to faces, to the faces of people whose prior behavior had been logged, weighted, and stored as a category of risk. What this means is that pigeons are not just passively registering your face. They are building a file on you, a probabilistic model of who you are based on accumulated experience. And that model informs how they move, where they go, how close they allow themselves to be. There is something almost vertiginous about sitting with this fully. You have, in all likelihood, a reputation among the birds of your city, not a subconscious, verbally articulated reputation. Nothing like the social calculus of human communities, but a behavioral record, a pattern of interactions, encoded and distributed through avian social learning in ways that mean your face carries information not just for the pigeons that have encountered you directly, but potentially for those that have been near birds that have. Because pigeons learn from watching each other. When one bird in a flock responds to a human face with avoidance behavior, others observe and incorporate that response. The information spreads laterally, not through language, but through the oldest form of knowledge transmission, watching what happens to someone else and adjusting accordingly. A face that one pigeon has learned to fear can become, through this social contagion of attention, a face that a flock treats with collective caution. None of those birds ever had a direct negative encounter with you, but they have, in some functional sense, heard about you. The memory that makes this possible is structured differently than most people assume. When we think of bird memory, if we think about it at all, we tend to imagine something basic, reflexive, something more like a stimulus-response system than genuine recollection. The reality of pigeon memory is considerably more complex and considerably more spatial. Pigeons build internal maps, not rough approximations of geography, detailed cognitive models of urban environments built from years of navigation and observation. These maps include information about food sources, shelter locations, hazards, escape routes, and embedded within them are associations. Intersections where certain kinds of people tend to appear, buildings where food was reliable, locations where threat occurred. Your face, if they've registered it, is likely mapped to a location, maybe to a route, maybe to a time of day. The bird on the ledge above the coffee shop doesn't just know your face, it may know that your face tends to appear at a particular time, moving in a particular direction with a particular predictability. In other words, it knows something about your routine, more specifically than you have ever known about it. The oldest behavioral observations of pigeons predate modern cognitive science by centuries, and they contain, scattered through records that weren't thinking about them as evidence for cognition, descriptions that look different now than they must have looked then. Accounts of city birds returning persistently to individuals who fed them are common enough to be unremarkable in historical writing, simply the expected consequence of conditioning. Accounts of birds avoiding specific streets during specific civic events. Accounts of flocks that seemed, to observers, to track the movements of particular people. What those observers almost certainly didn't consider was that the behavior they were describing required a specific cognitive infrastructure, required the ability to form, store, and retrieve a representation of an individual human face across weeks and months, required the behavioral flexibility to adjust responses based on remembered outcomes rather than instinctive templates. Pigeons were demonstrating episodic-like memory of specific events involving specific individuals, and because nobody expected that from a pigeon, the evidence sat in diaries and nature journals and administrative complaints for hundreds of years, waiting for a framework that could see it for what it was. There is a version of this that stays purely in the domain of animal cognition. Interesting, surprising, filed away as a fun fact about birds. That version is comfortable and contained. But there's another version that asks a slightly more uncomfortable question. If pigeons have been building detailed, persistent records of individual human faces for as long as cities have existed, and cities, in their urban density form, have existed for thousands of years, then the relationship between humans and urban pigeons is not the relationship most people imagine. It is not one-directional. It is not primarily about what humans do to pigeons. It is an ongoing, mutual observation, except that one party has been far more attentive than the other. We built the cities. We provided the grain, the ledges, the thermal warmth of heated stone. We created the conditions that made dense urban pigeon populations not just possible, but inevitable. And in return, without any kind of agreement, without any acknowledgement from either side, they began studying us. Not with malice, not with the mechanical indifference of surveillance, with the patient, adaptive intelligence of creatures that found a way to survive alongside the most complicated animal on Earth and realized, on some cognitive level, that the most reliable tool for that survival was understanding human individuals specifically. Spend time near a pigeon flock with this information in mind, and something starts to change in the experience. The birds that seem to be foraging randomly are not foraging randomly. They are moving through probability spaces built from accumulated observation, locations where food appeared before, routes that have historically been safe, distances that have historically been comfortable around particular categories of human behavior. The bird that holds its position when you walk past, when the others scatter, has registered something about you specifically, has concluded from its stored record that you are not a risk worth fleeing, that you occupy a category of humans, consistent, unthreatening, possibly known for sharing, that doesn't require the energy expenditure of flight. The bird that watches you from slightly too far away, that won't approach no matter what you offer, has a different file on you, or on someone who looks enough like you that the association carried. And the birds that seem to track your movement across a square, that turn when you turn, that adjust their position relative to yours in ways that seem almost social. Maybe doing something that we don't have clean language for, because we never developed clean language for the possibility that the birds we ignore might be watching us with something that functions in all the ways that matter, like attention. The philosopher Thomas Nagel once wrote about the difficulty of knowing what it is like to be a bat, about the fundamental inaccessibility of subjective experience across species. The question he was really asking was whether the inner lives of other creatures were, in principle, available to us at all. Pigeons are not bats. They are not the creatures of Nagel's thought experiment. But the question they raise is adjacent to his. Not what is it like to be one, but what kind of world is one navigating? What kind of information is one carrying? What does it feel like, if it feels like anything, to recognize a face you've seen 10,000 times, to have a model of a person built from years of accumulated proximity, and to have that person never once look at you as though you might be worth knowing? That question might not be answerable, but it is worth holding, because it suggests something about the texture of urban life that most people never consider. That the city you move through is not only occupied by other humans. It is observed, mapped, and socially organized by creatures whose cognitive lives are far richer than their appearance suggests. Creatures who have been building a picture of you, quietly, patiently, for as long as you've been there. The next time you pass a pigeon on a ledge, the unremarkable gray bird on the unremarkable gray concrete, in a city full of unremarkable gray birds on unremarkable gray concrete, you might pause for just a moment before the reflex to dismiss it takes over. You might consider that behind whatever the bird's eye registers when it settles on your face, there may be something, call it recognition, call it memory, call it something we don't have a word for yet, that knows you in the way that long familiarity eventually creates knowing. Not warmth, necessarily, not the recognition of a friend, but something more quietly unsettling than that. The recognition of someone who has been watching you for years, patiently and without introduction, in a city you both share, and who remembers, with a fidelity that outlasts most human attention, exactly who you are. If that's what's living in the spaces above your head, on the ledges of every building you've ever walked past, then the city is a stranger, older, more inhabited place than most of us have ever allowed ourselves to believe. Maybe it always has been.